Okay, that was Coyote Grace, and good morning once again. This is Beyond the Binary with Benny and Arya, a transgender news awareness show.
News, politics, art, cultural production.
All that fun stuff.
Everything. Well, good morning, everybody. How are you doing?
We are going to talk about a few stories today, and then we're going to try to get into a discussion on what it means to be genderqueer.
Yes.
Yeah, so
we've really focused a lot on more or less, quote, 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 big air quotes here, transgender writ large kind of experiences. And we're going to try to start talking more about, and then maybe this week and then the coming weeks as we have time allowed for it, to really start talking about other non-traditional manifestations or embodiments of being trans, whatever that might look like. Today we're going to try to get around to a little bit of genderqueer discussion.
Yes, and the politics of choice, especially in the family. We'll get on to that as well, because we both have experiences with that.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's go on to the story.
That's right.
What did you have?
Well,
here?
the first story that I have comes from Washington, D.C., and it's a update that's taking place in terms of how to get your birth certificate. So this is reported on the LA Times, and it really starts with the story from Caprice Williams, who's been waiting 4 years for a new birth certificate. Washington, D.C.
A new birth certificate?
A new birth certificate. So there's kind of a designation for those who don't know. Birth certificates tend to when it comes to changing or altering them around your sex designation, there's kind of these two options. One option is a brand new birth certificate. Another version is an amended birth certificate. An amended birth certificate continues to be the most one of the more quote popular, not popular in the sense that yay we like it, popular, and that's the one that most states use. And unfortunately, an amended birth certificate outs a trans person. And what I mean by that is on the birth certificate, it's noted as you were born one way and it has been altered or amended to another way. And so, for instance, if you're trying to get a job or some sort of organizational structure that demands a birth certificate, for instance, you're kind of put in the peculiar predicament of outing yourself because of the presence of your birth certificate. So that would be an amended. Now, what Washington, D.C. is doing here, or the District of Columbia specifically, the District of Columbia Council passed the country's most liberal policy for updating birth certificates. That hopefully might be, that some activists are hoping is going to be a model for the rest of the U.S. And essentially what's happening in Washington now, D.C., not the state, Washington, D.C. will grant new birth certificates. Remember, new, which means it's not amended. This is what your sex is on formal documentation. So that's an important designation.
Sure.
Right. So Washington's going to grant new birth certificates to trans people who provide a statement from a licensed health care provider that they have undergone, quote, appropriate treatment for gender transition. And interestingly, again, if you're under the auspice of a care provider, and that care provider is not demanding sex reassignment surgery, for instance, or gender confirmation surgery, then you're fine. And so it kind of falls back on who you're seeing, which is a whole nother slew of problems in terms of access, in terms of like who can you afford for a doctor, what types of doctors, what is it that your insurance is providing for. All of these things. Also, interestingly, this new policy in Washington, D.C. is it exempts people from needing to put your gender name or your name change in the newspaper for 3 weeks. So that also means that you're not publicly saying, I was born with or granted this name at birth by my parents or whatever, and now I'm going to this name, which oftentimes, if it's a drastic shift in terms of a gendered name, can really out you as well in a public forum.
Okay, so this is just a way, it's a less dangerous model, a less offensive model way of changing legalities of being, in your transition of being trans. So yeah, this seems like good news.
I think so. I think that it's certainly a really productive shift that's going on, and it makes it more an administrative item, meaning that it's not broadcast in the same way as it has been beforehand. So it kind of changes it around.
Right.
So I think that's very interesting.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly starting to see this shift happening, right? Like just a few weeks ago, we talked about the American Medical Association, but then before that, we talked about the United States Social Security system. Like there's shifts and changes that are happening
to accommodate
at the local and the state and the federal level.
To accommodate a transgender transition.
Yeah, and unfortunately, as it stands right now, as shown in D.C., every state, every location's different, so it can get really confusing. And one thing that I think if we're going to talk about cisgender privilege is, a cisgender privilege is not having to know what the policy is locally and what people have to go through if they're trans in order to designate what they need to designate or accessing what they need to access. I think that most trans people have an idea or know kind of where to go for whatever that gender transition looks like. Luckily, unfortunately, here in Illinois, the process of changing your designation on formal documents is quite simple. For Ari and I, for instance, though, the one struggle we have is that our birth certificates are from another state, and so sometimes there can be dialogues about which state to talk to because everyone you talk to has a different answer. So that itself can get really confusing because even at the very local level, like when we went to the DMV, for instance, they had to ask around because they didn't really know what to do until they kind of found somebody who finally knew what to do.
That's exactly the problem. Is a lot of folks just really don't know what to do in those situations.
And it's not to blame them. It's just it's a constant learning curve and a constant learning struggle, I think, overall. So
yeah, sure.
Why don't you tell us about Ashton Lee?
Of course, Ashton Lee, a trans man, California transgender teen, actually petitions for Jerry Brown to sign Bill 1266. Over the past several months, Ashton Lee, a transgender 16-year-old from Manteca, California, has been at the forefront of the state's political arena, attempting to convince legislators about the significance of passing Assembly Bill 1266, the bill which already passed California's Senate earlier this month, now awaits the signature of Governor Jerry Brown. Yesterday, Lee delivered a petition with 5,700 signatures. So this Assembly Bill 1266, what this bill would do is require that a pupil be permitted to participate in sex-segregated school programs and activities, including athletic teams and competitions, and use facilities consistent with his or her gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on the pupil's records. So this is a great move, and what I'm really excited about is having this young transgender teen really strive to spread this kind of awareness, this kind of importance. It's inspiring.
How many signatures did he collect that he took? Is it 5,000 some odd signatures?
5,700 signatures. So Lee really worked to get this going. And
yeah, I think one of the things that he had said in that article, if I can recall, was like in his own, really drawing on his own experience, is that like in physical ed classes, which at least for me when I was in California was mandatory, he's forced to play with the girls and he's forced to change with the girls, and so as a result it really kind of reifies, I think, the daily remembrance of, oh, no matter how you're identifying, we're going to keep reminding you of something, which is going to, in some way, every day school becomes a trigger point for gender dysphoria, for instance. And it really kind of can aid in that kind of downward spiral of really struggling just to get through your day, knowing you have to do it one more time.
In a previous interview with CNN, Lee stated that, "I just want to be treated the same as all the other boys. But my school forces me to take PE in a class of all girls and live as someone I'm not. I can't learn and succeed when every day in that class leaves me feeling isolated and alone." So these transgender folks that come out and they make these sort of activist choices to, defend their right to be trans and spread awareness about it, it makes me really curious how vulnerable they may feel in these positions.
Yeah, sure.
I just find it really, it's uplifting, it's inspiring to see these kind of stories, but I also wonder how vulnerable that actually makes them.
Like Ashton specifically?
Yeah, definitely. So the bill has not gone without resistance from some legislators.
Well, I think one of the beauties of activism is that you have the privilege and the capacity to put yourself on the line. And I think that's part of the struggle.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I mean, because you really make me think about, like, what does it mean to kind of be out in this capacity. I think that, like, Ashton Lee being out there, like, it is inspiring. But Ashton Lee has also made that type of activist commitment, and that's part of being an activist, is that you kind of make that commitment. It's not for everybody to be that out. It's not for everybody to have that kind of support. It's not for everybody, because everyone has these differential kind of experiences. The same way that you and I are marked by having this radio show here in town.
I know whenever I bring up age, it's kind of problematic to assume someone might not be ready for something because they're younger, but I just find it so just ridiculous, we could say, that we have to have a 16-year-old really put themselves forth, to make these sort of activist choices, that they're forced to be, the face of transgender rights for his community. It's just, it's so overwhelming. I can't even imagine. It's such a difficult time. Then, I remember being 16 and in school and being trans, and I was not out. I didn't know what was going on. And I'm so excited that there's more awareness today and that this person can have a voice. But they are so young, and I don't, I wonder what pressures are. I'm excited, don't get me wrong. And I hate to hesitate and be like, I just wish that I just wish that this wasn't so needed, that someone has to make themselves...
Based on your experience, would you say that you are... Because this is what I feel like this is what I'm hearing. Based on your experience, do you feel afraid for him?
I feel afraid for him. I feel... It's mostly... I was going to say it's mostly the mental struggle, but I can't really even say that, because you don't know what kind of joy this brings him as well, what kind of confidence this brings him, and I'm sure... having a voice is such a great way to have agency over your body, to really make yourself present in the community is, I bet it's a great feeling. I mean, this person's only 16 years old, and here we have this article. So I'm just going to read this part. The bill has not gone without resistance from some legislators. According to the Sacramento Bee, Senator Jim Nielsen told his colleagues in July that the legislation would impose no standard of evidence to verify what gender students declare that day. I know.
I'm sorry, because every other day, that's the problem, is that cis people don't have to do that anyways.
Exactly. So let me continue. Other conservative lawmakers have claimed that students will take advantage of the bill, such male-identifying teens attempting to join female sports teams for a competitive advantage.
Blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, it's like the old argument. Like, I get so tired of that argument. The moment I start hearing it,
This is what upsets me, though, is that we have people like this in positions of authority, and we need a 16-year-old trans boy to actually come forward and make himself so vulnerable to be like, look, that is just ridiculous what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it is so just dismissive of trans identities. It's not wanting to deal with trans people. It's just saying, shut up. It's telling the 16-year-old that's made themselves so vulnerable to just stop complaining. I really can't. I can't deal with this, because these are just people who really don't understand what is going on for transgender people, especially at that age. So, however, this is, Lee responded to this. However, Lee and other activists have articulated that this argument is invalid. Of course it is. As administrators, as administrators should be able to discern who is attempting to exploit options enabled by the bill and the overarching goal of allowing teens to self-identify within the public school system should not be undermined by this mentality. Exactly, right? So the bill will help me so much in school, Lee says, and people like me. And it will make it so much easier to graduate and be who we are and be accepted and understood. It's just going to make it so much easier. And I think that says it all.
Yeah.
This isn't about whatever that guy was saying. This is about, students like Lee just being able to be in an environment that makes them successful, right? Like,
that's exactly what this is about. And it's interesting because the resistance always comes from this kind of conservative baseline that really just reveals what it is transphobia, and it's also old school kind of patriarchal, sexist ideas of the need to separate the sexes, because recall, if you will, that boys are so uncontrollable about their urges and girls are so incredibly passive that we have to protect the young girls. And the logic behind that is absolutely ridiculous, because that becomes the driving logic that continues to keep and perpetuate this kind of transphobic legislation, these transphobic ideas. It's just astounding to me in some capacity.
It's also just perpetuating gender stereotypes that are so problematic. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think of other things to say about this, but I'm not sure if you want to move on.
Go ahead.
Well, I can't even remember. It's morning. Good morning, everyone. This is Beyond the Binary. We're just going over some news stories right now.
Well, I guess I have this here, more military news, if you will. The Palm Center, let's see here. It's a research institute called the Palm Center, and the Palm Center is the one that kind of coordinated a decade worth of research to help kind of legitimate the overturn of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or DADT.
Okay.
And the Palm Center has received just recently a $1.35 million grant over the next 3 years to study transgender service in the U.S. military. So the project director, Indra Lucero, is the person who kind of directs what's now called the Palm Center's Transgender Military Initiative. This individual has commissioned 16 scholars to conduct 11 studies investigating whether and how the U.S. Armed Forces could include transgender troops without undermining readiness. I don't know what readiness exactly means, but in areas ranging from privacy and medical accommodations to the experiences of foreign militaries and sports programs. They're also advocating that this research is going to help to boost a public forum and conversation around trans bodies by providing facts and figures around what that experience is. I don't know, it sounds like the underlying assumption is if we study trans experiences in military, somehow that's going to be the same as trans experiences not in the military? I don't know. But that's how it seems to be being pitched right now at some capacity. The current U.S. military regulations regularly lead transgender service members to be discharged if their gender identity is found out. For those who don't know, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell does not apply to transgender service members, only to gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals in the military.
Once again, this is just people not at first understanding what to do with trans people.
What's that? How so?
Well, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell not covering trans folks at all. They're just not even thinking of trans folks, right?
Well, no, we're right, because the policy was put in place not with trans people in mind back in the 90s when it was first instituted. So it's not even that it's trans exclusive, it's that the policy never attended to. And unfortunately, historically, since DADT and other political moves have gone in, the T in LGBT has been added on to this LGB movement, right? And so as a result, I think over time, people have largely forgotten that policies that affected or affect the LGB part of the population sometimes affect differentially the T part of the population. And so when we talk about LGBT communities, plural, we have to really attend to these various communities functioning around and trying to maneuver what seem to be policies that affect different parts of the population differently. Does that make sense?
Of course, yeah, interesting.
And so, I mean, one of the interesting things is Don't Ask, Don't Tell had to be repealed by Congress because it was a legislative move. Stopping the exclusion or the ousting of trans people, however, can basically come really just at, I guess, the wish or the whim of President Barack Obama or the President of the U.S., if it's not during Barack Obama's term now. But apparently it can just kind of happen under the leadership of Barack Obama at the Pentagon, which is very interesting. So that it doesn't have to have the whole legislative kind of process that the repeal of DADT did. And I voiced this before, but I really struggle with kind of military in general. So I'm always kind of back and forth in this tense space between what does this mean for trans politics writ large, what does this mean for just ensuring that we can have a larger, more robust military, which means larger, robust American imperialism around the world. So I really kind of struggle with that kind of double-edged sword there.
What I do like is saying that trans folks are being recognized in the military, of course, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, because we critiquing the military and critiquing individuals in the military are two different things. It goes back to system and individual, right? Or structure and individual, and how these two kind of interact with one another. And so it's not about the individuals who are in the military. It's great that there is recognition taking place, but kind of at the structural, institutional level, I kind of struggle with what is the military, and what does it mean to just continue to find ways to broaden who can now serve. One of the things institutionally and structurally is that some people, if they struggle to find work, the military is oftentimes one of those spaces that they can go to access that type of work. So I find that very interesting.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and go on to the last story you have there?
Okay. This story is Micropolis. It's titled Micropolis, Transgender.
I think that's like the name of a radio station I caught from reading through that.
Oh, yeah?
I think it's like a radio show, and then this is like an interview.
Okay, this is fun. I'm very serious. Transgender training slash sex work survival tips. And the reason why we're talking about sex work survival tips today is, one, because we respect the concept of sex work for one, and we also respect the idea that sex workers are very much vulnerable to perpetrators of attack, people who will attack. There are tons of trans women of color, particularly, that are murdered during sex work. And, it's not chosen work, of course, or maybe it is, but a lot of trans folks turn to sex work for reasons of not being able to get employed. And I'm just bringing this up because I know there's stigma on the idea of sex work.
Well, there's a huge stigma. And interestingly, when we talk about kind of the reality of violence against sex workers, which is quite prevalent, right, that we tend to look at things like jobs like, what are those shows, like crab fishermen, right? Like, they're really dangerous jobs, like some of the most dangerous. Well, so is sex work. Sex work is a very dangerous job. Sex work is
a very dangerous job.
And so I think, and it's also a job where you don't have access to health insurance. You don't have access to the channels that help you get through it. You're bullied from both ends.
Because it's not regulated.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So what are some of these tips here?
We have some survival tips here for someone who is a sex worker. And this is, of course, speaking to trans folks, but I think it could work for anybody.
I do too.
Yeah, these are just kind of survival tips for anyone who's in someone's car or what have you. That's usually the way of picking up a sex worker. So, Senpai Alina, the self-defense instructor for New York sex workers, gives and provides 3 tips to her students in the event that they're in a car with a dangerous or violent John, is what this person is.
Well, John, like the term for...
Right, yeah, it's that neutral. So, number 1, keep the window cracked a little early on in case you need to kick it out. So, I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
The window being a way to escape. Number 2, even more dramatic, is the back roll. If you put your back up against the passenger door and start kicking...
Kick, it says.
the John, with both feet, especially for these girls who are wearing heels. Yeah, kick. Open the door and back roll out. It seems very dramatic. It does seem dramatic, but it can work. Yeah. So this is just being able to actually defend yourself.
If you need to.
So
one of them is keep the window slightly cracked so that it's easier to kind of break it if you need to.
And the other is to put your back against the passenger door and use it to sort of, stabilize yourself.
While you're kicking.
And kick someone and defend yourself when needed.
And then open the latch of the door so you can roll out while you're kicking.
This is important advice because it's real.
Yeah.
This is so needed and it's so necessary because we're always hearing stories about trans women that are in sex work that are murdered.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the last one,
which is difficult to read, but
when a quick escape is not an option, you can gouge out an eye or you can crush a trachea. Especially if someone's trying to choke you, so they're up close and personal. It's important to do anything you can to get away before you're unconscious. because that's when you lose control.
And what it says there is like it can really happen that being knocked unconscious, like through being choked or whatnot, can be really quick. And so trying to find whatever means you can in order to protect yourself, just survive that. So it's very interesting news, and we're going to certainly post this on our Facebook, facebook.com/beyondthebinary.
We think these tips are important.
Absolutely, and please, by all means, pass them around and talk about them. Well, we're at the halfway mark, so let's go ahead and turn to a song here.
Okay.
Do you want to hear some violin, or do you want to hear something about being different?
Let's do the violin.
Okay.
Let's talk about this.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure on the specifics here, but the song is called "Meditation from Ties," popular song. It's being played by Tona Brown, and Tona Brown is a black trans woman, violinist, who has performed at the White House and also has, I believe, an operatic voice. I've heard her sing once as well at the White House. I believe it was at the White House where I wasn't there myself. I saw some video. It sounded like I was at the White House with her, like we're just kicking it. I watched this on a YouTube video that she had posted. I follow her on YouTube, on Facebook. Very interesting, really beautiful work. So we're going to play her song, listen to a few underwriting commercials, and we'll be right back.
It is quite slow. So. Stick with us. I know it's morning, but it's an enjoyable song, so let's do it.
Welcome back to Beyond the Binary.
Beyond the Binary with Benny and Aria, and we are a show that discusses transgender awareness, politics, art, and
news,
all
things.
that fun stuff. Yeah.
You can catch us on facebook.com/Beyond
the Binary.
Or you can email us at bthbradio@gmail.com.
Nice.
Thank you.
Alrighty. So we are done with our news stories for today, and we thought we'd actually do a bit of discussion on just some things. Okay, so we're going to actually talk about other identities within being transgender that we believe are under the transgender umbrella, but also are in general just really important because they can attribute to transgender folks in general, such as the identity of being genderqueer. And a lot of people don't understand our use of the word queer. Whenever I use the word queer, especially in front of folks who are just not, LGBT oriented or in general, they see it as a slur, right?
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on queer being a slur, and how are we using it today?
Well, it's interesting, that question. So, terms change, identities change and shift, and they move. And queer has a very interesting history, as most identities and words do. And the history of queer has a very meticulous and scary kind of use. And so when we talk about it as a slur, historically it has been used as a slur. And so when we talk about kind of age differentials, and this isn't me attempting to be ageist or anything like that, but there is a recognition, at least in my own experience, of older gay and lesbian folks who, when they hear the word queer, it kind of makes them cringe. And I've had a lot of older friends, particularly back in Southern California, when they hear the word, that they kind of cringe a little bit. And that's more a reaction of kind of a time in which they came to where that term was used against them in very violent ways, right? So that the word queer was also matched maybe with a fist right afterwards. And so what does that mean to kind of trigger people in some capacity? And so there's certainly that kind of past. Queer, as we tend to use it now, is used in such a capacity that kind of exists in alignment with, as well as in resistance to, gay, lesbian, and bisexual identities. Particularly if we take Aria and I's relationship here, that neither of us identify as gay or as lesbian or as bisexual, because of this kind of relationship that we have and the way that both of our genders and sexes move in different capacities in relation to one another, we cannot have, by that logic, a same or different sex, or same or opposite sex, or what have you, if that makes sense. Is that what you're asking for?
Sure. Really, I just wanted to focus on, you talked perfectly about why we're really discussing this, and just the word, how it can be now empowered, right?
Sure. I mean, yeah. For me, I've come to use the term as a form of empowerment for myself.
It's also an academic term.
Yeah. I mean, Yes, it really kind of gained notoriety in reaction to the AIDS genocide in America back in the late 80s, early 90s, when we had groups like Queer Nation, ACT UP, that were really starting to use queer as a form of empowerment, saying, you cannot use this against us. We're going to use it as a mode of resistance. The same way that gay was at one point a very radical term that was being kind of appropriated and used, and gay became beautiful. It became a way to kind of take back the term that was used against gay people at the time. Academically, queer theory certainly has its own trajectory, and it's used in interesting ways as well, as an identity marker, as well as a way of kind of exploring the world in what we might call peculiar ways. So if we go back to the older way of what the word means, it means kind of peculiar or odd.
I was just about to go over that.
Okay. But, yeah.
Because I like to do this.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've heard me do this before, but I like to go on dictionary.com and look up a word and, see what the word means in the dictionary, as opposed to how I, in comparison to how I use the word.
Yeah.
So, especially in our community, queer as an adjective is strange or odd from a conventional viewpoint, unusually different, singular, a queer notion of justice. I like that. That sounds exactly like how I might use it. Number 2, of a questionable nature or character, suspicious, shady, something queer about the language of the prospectus kept investors away. That was a way to use the word queer. Number 3, oh, I love this. Not feeling physically right or well, giddy, faint, or qualmish, to feel queer.
I feel a bit queer today.
I feel a bit queer today.
I'll be using that for the rest of the day.
Interesting.
How
I
are
love
you?
The accent.
How are you? I feel a bit queer.
Oh, gosh.
And then I will put the back of my hand delicately to my forehead.
Benny.
Oh, am I not on camera? Sorry.
Okay. So this is how. Okay. So that was the dictionary definition, and Benny explained how queer is being used today. But I like this definition. Strange or odd from a conventional viewpoint, unusually different. And okay, so we brought up the word or the term identity, what have you, genderqueer. Mm-hmm. So now those two words coming together, right? Mm-hmm. That's what we're doing. So queer, strange or odd, okay, relate that to gender. A gender that is strange or odd. In comparison to conventional standards, I would say that makes sense to what these identities are.
Yes.
So the word genderqueer, that is an identity. People are actually ascribing to this identity.
Yep.
Benny's pointing at themselves.
Yes, I'm one of those individuals who has identified as genderqueer for quite some time.
So these are... Yeah, you were going to continue, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
These are folks that what? What is genderqueer? Can a transgender person be genderqueer?
I think so. I think it's interesting the way that kind of functions. I mean, even the word transgender and that term as an identity is used in multiple ways. Not all trans people identify or understand transgender in the same way. Not all genderqueer people understand genderqueer in the same way. Some people use transgender as a, quote, umbrella term is often how it's described, as a whole slew of to kind of describe a whole slew of people that, whether I would say unconsciously or consciously, challenge the gender binary. And I say consciously because that might be an individual who actively seeks to change or transition or alter the way that their body has been assigned and therefore socialized to look and act a certain way, so they challenge that by doing all kinds of things. But unconsciously, in a way that maybe you just happen to not really recognize and realize that you're doing gender, quote, wrong, because maybe your version of right gender is a queer way. And that's kind of the beauty of queerness, right, is that to you in your location, that's the norm. But to outsiders, it looks peculiar or queer.
Exactly, which is why the word is used for the sake of everyone.
And
listening.
so back to your original question about can genderqueer people or can transgender people be genderqueer? Absolutely. I personally identify as both genderqueer and as trans.
I mean, I could have answered that for myself because I kind of identify as genderqueer, and I definitely used it in the beginning of my transition to sort of identify.
And there was a lot of resistance, as I recall, from some of the trans groups that we were going to.
So much resistance, and I think that's because I think a lot like maybe our listeners right now, they don't fully understand the word genderqueer. I think people can grasp transgender a bit easier because it is a bit more on that binary. But when we talk about genderqueer, it is so in between. It is people who are choosing an identity that is not necessarily, man, woman. It's of its own.
Well, and I think that, like, your comment kind of brings up these two ideas for me. First,
Okay.
and this was actually going to be another discussion, so I can kind of bring it up a little bit about choice. About when you say, like, a genderqueer identity is this person's choice. Yes, it's choice, meaning I've chosen to use this as a description. But part of that choice is the capacity to realize, it's recognizing that what exists doesn't quite fit how I experience my own body and my own gendered experience still. And genderqueer for me has opened a space to allow me to just be okay with that. It's allowed me to deal with things like dysphoria on my own terms. It's allowed me to question whether or not I want to make certain choices or take certain paths, right? Like HRT, for instance, but still recognizing I'll be okay if I don't. And some people do not have that kind of perspective. Some people do not have the choice because some people's experiences demand transition in ways that my body doesn't exactly demand so immediately. So I also don't want to create like a hierarchy of more or less genderqueer, more or less trans. It's just varying experiences that do not fit into the binary of you're either this or that. And I think that's part of the problem with genderqueer even in some trans spaces, because the transgender support groups that I went to prior to meeting Erin, and then also as Erin and I went to a few groups back in at least California, I didn't find a home often in those spaces. And that was primarily because I was not identifying with the traditional transgender script. I was not desiring a strict transition from one side, quote, to the other side, quote. But rather was trying to fluctuate back and forth because that was more what I was experiencing in my own mind and body and soul and spirit, right? And so genderqueer, like what you were, this is the other part. Genderqueer in those spaces, I think, yes, partially might be we don't get it. But second, it also kind of challenges or destabilizes the security of a support group where people have finally found a home with a script that works for them. And so for me to walk into the spaces where slews of people have identified similarly, right, we're in the support group, we all have similar kind of narratives about what it means to be trans, and then all of a sudden I show up and I go, nope, that's not like me at all. Well, I'm gonna feel ousted because I'm not fitting in with those who have kind of created the space.
Genderqueer, in an essence, is allowing for a certain kind of ambiguity. Is that right?
Yes, right.
So it's allowing people to identify, on their own terms, right? With how they're going to sort of navigate their own gender and their own transition. Because a genderqueer person can take steps that a transgender person would in some sort of transition to be happier, to be, their gender-bending selves. And this is a necessary thing, right? This is something that's also just as relevant, just as valid as transgender identities. I just think it's less heard of and far more difficult for people to understand, and that's why it's not as communicated. But genderqueer people can, these folks some of them end up having surgeries. I mean, there are what is that word? They're on Netflix.
Documentary?
A documentary, right. I was close. On genderqueer folks as well, so there's information. Yeah, I remember we watched one when we were at the Pecan House. We watched one documentary.
Documentary. You put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable.
I can't speak right now when it comes to that word.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things, you bring up this interesting question,
yeah.
I think, next to the can I see your genitals question.
Oh, gosh.
On the list of things that you should never ask a trans
We should go over
person.
that because that recently happened to me.
Well, that's going to actually feed into exactly what happened to you, is the question of, are you going to have the surgery, or are you doing this, or are you going to go all the way?
Okay.
Those questions do not pertain to genderqueer people in the same way as some trans experiences, primarily because it's not uncommon to meet or locate a trans or a genderqueer person who may or may not also identify as transgender, who maybe HRT or hormone replacement therapy is enough and nothing else. Or maybe it's just having a spiritual gender transition. Or maybe it's just having the capacity to know that you are identifying enough. Or maybe it's having mixed sex designations on the outside, as long as that's what kind of works for you on the inside. So maybe
these are all right. These are all variations of using the word genderqueer, and like we're saying, this is a word that really that advocates for this sort of ambiguity and for people to identify strange or odd. Right, the word queer. Mm-hmm. That's what this is about, and of course, it's difficult to understand. We'll continue to talk about the term genderqueer. This is not the last time we'll bring it up.
Let's go and talk about what recently happened to you specifically, because I think
that's hilarious.
It's on that list of things like, hey, don't do this.
There are a list of things you should never ask a transgender person. Okay, you shouldn't.
Like,
we shouldn't even go there.
I'm just kidding.
We shouldn't even go. Please don't be afraid to speak to trans folks, but there is definitely certain questions you just shouldn't ask.
Well, this kind of goes for specifically yes, but
someone actually came up to me, and this is not the first time this has happened to me. Mm-hmm. And they had the nerve to ask me how far I am in my transition. They have the nerve to ask me if I've had the surgery yet. If I've had any surgery.
Because why? Because what does that surgery do for you? Are you going to be a what?
Oh, a full woman. So they're trying to define what a woman means for me. So, I mean, it's just what it is it's offensive and it's innocent at the same time. Because this person, I know, had good intentions. They wanted to be vocal with me. They wanted to connect with me. But in doing so, they were really invading my privacy. And I think that is the important underlying part of my experience with folks who talk to me and ask me questions that you should never ask a trans person, is that it's a total invasion of privacy.
Well, particularly if that person's a cisgender person and they quote, want to learn.
Yeah.
That's not the purview of the body that is, or the individual that is already in that oppressed, marginal position. Right? Your learning has to come from somewhere else. But one of the questions you shouldn't ask is this, and I think it's interesting because you really bring this up, Aria, and that's the idea that the question is innocent in some capacity, but it's also what we've noted here as microaggressions. It's a way to really kind of police sex and gender. It's a way to ask, and another way of asking it is, are you there yet? Are you real enough for me? Can I now start counting you as a woman? As opposed to maybe there's variations of what woman looks like, because there are, and maybe this is as far as I want to go, and maybe the script that you're drawing on, right, just doesn't work for some people.
Exactly. And it's definitely interesting, because when I'm asked that question, or when people come up to me and I'm not surprised necessarily, because I've totally prepared for it, but it is still it still takes me back a bit, I don't really know how to respond. But what I did do was kind of just write them off a bit, because there's not much you can say, and I know that I'm offended, so I'm not gonna educate them.
That's right.
And I'll be sort of just, that's how I respond to it anyway.
I think that's a fair way to respond too.
Oh, totally. Because that's such an invasive question. Okay, so I think we'll actually come up with a list, and I'm sure there's one out there of questions you just shouldn't ask a trans person.
Sure, yeah, there's tons of them out there.
And a lot of people want to know, how do I communicate with a trans person? I feel like a lot of people are on our side. They just don't know how to express that. So I think we should definitely have a day of talking about that.
Here's another thing that you could also consider. When's the last time you walked up to a cisgender person that you just met and asked, hey, so are you, like, for reals? Are your genitals lined up with what I'm saying? You probably haven't.
Right.
So why would you ask a transgender person that question?
Cisgender being non-transgender.
Right. So the interaction itself at the core is already marking the fact that you refuse to see the trans person as they desire to be seen.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the peculiar kind of component.
I almost can understand, like, if I think really hard about it anyway, like, it hurts to think about. but it's actual people that don't have any gender identity issues.
Sure.
And I can't imagine what that's like.
Right.
Because they're assuming this binary, like, oh, I'm comfortable with my genitalia matching my gender assignment. So other people need to be that way.
Yeah.
And it's so confusing for me because I don't know what that's like.
Sure.
So this is where there is some disconnection between the questioning, between, this being offensive or not. There's just this total disconnection between me and someone who is not transgender, that when they start wanting to ask questions, it can come off as offensive.
Sure. It's interesting.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes left.
Well, we actually have we have another song here.
Right, we always have a third song.
Well, yeah, we try to. We have a third song today that we kind of want to close off with. It's called "I'll Be Different."
Yeah.
I'll Be Different by Joshua Bastian Cole and Julie Lloyd. So I guess we can leave you with that song now. Is there anything else you want to add this week?
No, I think we're good. I think that we definitely should continue talking about genderqueer. I don't know if people have grasped this identity yet.
Sure.
People who are just hearing this identity today, look into it if you're curious. Yeah, but we'll come back to this.
Sure. All right, well, we'll see you all next week. You can visit us where?
Facebook.com/Beyond the Binary.
And you can email us at?
bthbradio@gmail.com.
Oh, my goodness.
It's kind of easy because we're beyond the binary. It's be the B. Beyond the binary. Sorry, I'm just laying that out. Okay.
Okay, have a good week, everyone.